Okay, hello, Riddick.
Hey, George.
Um, this is the monetary frontier, and today I think this is a great accomplishment for us. Is that Riddick is going to present his discussion on Jeff Snider, and I think it's really laden with insights that are general and axiomatic, and not necessarily an attack on Jeff Snider. That is Jeff Snider creating that opportunity for us. We really wish him well and don't want to impede what his objectives are. But anyway, this is going to be a good show. Riddick, first I'd like to ask you, um, uh, Riddick, this is going to be our topic for this YouTube, and I guess we don't have a lot of content, but we have very pithy, very useful content, which we're using Jeff Snider as our way to get this across in the easiest way. Riddick, do you dislike Jeff? I mean, why are you picking on him?
No, in fact, have followed Jeff for, several years on Twitter. And I think the reason why we wanted to discuss his views is because he, I think, is a reflection of a focus on the Fed that we think is unwarranted. And our views, we think, are the reality, which is that the economic data, the fiscal flows, all create a worldview that I think is very different. So I thought it would be good to compare them.
So it's almost like Jeff Snider's so well organized and practiced in his presentation that to use him as a backboard for what you want to relay here is a great opportunity.
Yes, he's clear about what he thinks, so it makes
Okay.
it easy.
And I hope if we're ever in a place where we're having beers, I hope Jeff Snider doesn't get excited with us. But anyway, let's carry on. Okay, Riddick, here's your starting point. And by the way, I find all this discussion really interesting, and sort of a little bit radical in terms of like the followers of Jeff and also the followers of many people on X and also their Substacks and also even in media, economists, and so on. So why don't you just start us off here?
Great. So yeah, so just to back up a little bit, if I had to kind of give a broad characterization of our views and Jeff's views, in a sentence, I would describe kind of how we're seeing things as we're in a state of fiscal dominance, and in that world, the Fed is nearly powerless to slow the economy. And I think the way that Jeff would describe it is similar to what we're saying, which is that markets and the economic data disagree with each other. So we agree with that. We think, the economic data reflects the reality, which is nominal GDP still running at, 5-6% annualized. And he obviously sees that same, NGDP print. But his interpretation is, the markets and markets he points to tend to be like the Treasury yield curve, the path of Fed funds rates, et cetera. Those markets disagree with that economic data. And so how he interprets or how he reconciles those things is the markets must be right. The markets must be sniffing out something that the economic data is missing or that everybody else is missing. And so in these two tweets of his, where he talks about the yield curve inversion, so he's pointing to the Treasury yield curve. And we have obviously lots of thoughts about the Treasury yield curve, which we'll point to. But in the left tweet here, he's pointing to the idea that in the short run, the Fed has raised interest rates. But he looks at the long end of the curve, the 10-year, the 30-year, and points to those rates still being relatively anchored to 3%, 4%. So this is the Treasury yield curve. And he asked the question, why is that? Why is it that long-term Treasury bonds still are in this range? And what does that tell us about growth and inflation expectations? And then he makes a similar point on the right, which is that when the curve inverts as he thinks it has, that's an indicator that recession is coming. So he says, you better start watching out straight away, not 18 months from now. And this tweet was July 2022, which means 18 months later is basically right where we are today. And I think that that call relying on the yield curve has not really worked. So I think that's a good description of his views, which is he sees the market data as disagreeing with the economic data, and only one of those can be right. And for Jeff, it's the market data. For us, it's the economic data.
Yes, so Riddick, let me accuse you of something here. The terrible words. You're saying this time is different.
This is the first time since the 1940s where there's been a sustained fiscal impulse. So I think I'm very comfortable making that point.
Can you flesh that out? Like, why does that give you a trump card here?
Yeah. So
And that's
typically,
in terms of bridge, not the candidate. Go ahead.
yeah. So when we think about, how do actors create new money for the economy? There's basically only two sources. There's, the fiscal side, the treasury spending, and then there's banks creating their own money by loans. And, we've tried to formalize this as well as we can through a monetary impulse and a fiscal impulse in our work. And typically, in periods like past, however many decades, the fiscal impulse doesn't have a huge kind of determiner. It's not a huge determinant in terms of cyclical outcomes. It's more of the endogenous credit creation. But this is the first period since the COVID period that the federal government has flooded the U.S. economy with over $3 trillion more than what they typically would in a normal cyclical period. And the U.S. economy is still grappling with that, $3 trillion fiscal excess impulse that's sloshing through the economy. And that's why when we look at things like the yield curve and how it's supposedly inverted, that doesn't reflect reality. The reality is that there's enough, funds in the economy for the yield curve to be steep. And we think that the true yield curve is indeed steep.
Okay, so you're not saying this time is different. You're saying this is just as it was in World War II.
Yeah, the mechanics work only one way. So from the mechanical perspective, no time is ever different. It's just that since the 1940s, since World War II, there's never been a $3 trillion or inflation adjusted even, there's never been that large of a fiscal impulse. So all of these traditional, metrics that rely on private credit creation, bank money creation driving the cycle, those I think have all broken and continue to break.
Okay, you're probably tell me to move on if you answer this more fully in further slides, but this is a deep, big market, U.S. Treasuries.
Yes.
And I don't get it how you can not dismiss it, but just say it ain't the real curve, given its size and what it has shown in the past 30 years. I know you're citing World War II. Well, to me, that makes perfect sense, but still, the U.S. Treasury market's a big damn market. Can you want to comment on that now, or do you address?
I think the next slide we can hit on how we're seeing the Treasury.
Got it.
So here I've three lines last 20 years. So the blue line is the market 10-year Treasury yield. So that's the 10-year yield that's stated. And then the red line is the 30-year conventional mortgage rate. So this is what gets packaged into MBS, securities. And then the green line is a mortgage rate implied 10-year yield. So this is starting from the MBS rate or the mortgage rate and deriving, a long end of the yield curve that we think is more apt. And so what you'll see is that typically the spread between the market 10-year Treasury yield and the 30-year mortgage rate is very contained through time. And right now, there seems to be a large dislocation where that spread is much larger. So like you said, the Treasury market is a huge market. How is it that, this market can no longer reflect reality or can somehow be distorted? And so we think that the answer to that is the legacy of the last 15 years of QE and the Fed's intervention in the Treasury market. So we think that, the Fed's balance sheet right now is like upwards of 6, 7, 8 trillion. It's holding a huge chunk of the outstanding supply of U.S. Treasuries, and that has a depressive effect for term premium. And what we're seeing through that is that the mortgage rate is
you mean the term premium of the U.S. Treasury curve, not term premium risk. Go ahead. Sorry.
So it's distorting the term premium of the U.S. Treasury curve, not of the true risk-free curve. So when we look at another sort of risk-free security, which is MBS, as these securities are sort of guaranteed.
Why do you say that's what are you talking about? That's mortgages. Why is that risk-free?
So mortgages, and I think you can probably speak to this better, but these mortgages that are put into MBS
No,
are
I'm setting you up, hoping you make a mistake so I can charge you. But go ahead.
okay. Well, those securities are still guaranteed by the U.S. government and by these GSEs, if I'm right.
Okay, so their use in mortgage-backed securities, of which the Fed, of course, has bought a ton of and recognizes them as risk-free, as suitable to be in the SOMA accounts and also in the recent QE and sales in QT,
Right.
that makes it risk-free.
Right.
Okay, cool.
So for the mortgage rate to be, sitting at 7-8% right now, despite treasury yields being far lower than that, that tells us something, which is that the treasury yield curve, the long end of the treasury yield curve is likely too low. And that's because one, the Fed, does own a significant chunk of this market. And then when the Fed conducts that operation and buys some of those bonds, the Fed has the ability to set, the price at which it wants to buy those. And in doing that, it's effectively administering rates, starting with the Fed funds rate and then out to like a couple of years out on the yield curve. But then with QE is able to pull that administrating of rates even further out to, 5-year, 10-year. And we think we still see we're still seeing the effects of that for why the 10-year yield, the treasury yield has gotten dislocated. So if we decide, that the treasury yield curve we're seeing isn't the real risk-free curve, then I think it starts to match to the reality, which is the economic data continuing to come in extremely hot, employment, labor, nominal spending. Those things all cannot reflect an economy or a yield curve that's inverted. And I think that the green line, the mortgage rate implied 10-year yield, points to a very clearly positively sloped curve. And I think that's much more reflective of the reality.
Okay, I noticed these the green, the blue line are but for noise. I would think they have to do more mortgages, they have to do less treasury. It's something sector segmentation are pretty well right on top of each other, especially since despite what you said, especially since QE, QT, QE1 and QE2 and QE3.
Yes,
they're almost one. They are one and the same, and it's not until it looks like the end of 2022 that we get this digression
yes,
between mortgages and U.S. Treasuries. Are the risk-free rate as implied by mortgage-backed securities
right,
versus U.S. Treasuries? What do you think of that? Like the fact that actually it's drawn in together through QE, I guess, and low rates, and then it only starts to diverge wildly at the end of 2022.
Yes, that's a good point. So if I had to explain why that divergence begins in 2022, so I think I would explain it as since 2022, this has been the first real rate hike campaign of the Fed since the financial crisis. And as the Fed is raising rates, the market is still in this fiction that the Fed will eventually return us to the low rate, secular stagnation, kind of slow growth world of the 2010s. And because the market thinks that, and we think incorrectly, long end rates, even as early as the 5-year, those rates can still stay relatively tethered because one, the Fed, is able to administer rates as far as it wants, and the market believes that the Fed at any moment, at the first sign of trouble, could go back to administering those rates. So the market is pricing in some risk of those rates being administered. And we think that there's no world in which the Fed really does that because, as we'll get into, the Fed doesn't really have the power to deliver a recession like it thinks it can.
Okay, let's unless you want to talk more about it, let's close out this slide by putting this back into our original start, which is Jeff Snider consideration.
Yeah. So Jeff Snider points to the yield curve. So right now, the 2s, 10s, or I think is the one that he prefers to look at. Right now, the 2-year yield is substantially higher than the 10-year yield. And that reflects all the things we just talked about, which is the 2-year yield is, a reflection of the kind of short end forward path of monetary policy. And rates are kind of expected to stay relatively elevated in the short run. But over the next 10 years, either, the Fed will resume QE or yield curve control, the Fed will be able to administer rates, the Fed will bring rates back down, or there will be some sort of recession or some sort of like event that causes rates to fall. Jeff looks at the yield curve and says the yield curve is pricing in all of those things. The yield curve, like you said, is a very deep market, and the yield curve is made up of all these market actors that are expressing their view on the economy. So if such a large market is inverting its curve, that must tell us something pessimistic or bearish about the economy. And so what we think is, no, the economic data is what you have to look at. The economic data, the fiscal flows, the term structure of NGDP, how NGDP expectations are likely to evolve. That's the reality. And markets have the ability to be wildly wrong for extended periods of time. And since 2022, as early as 2022, despite inflation being at 5-6%, despite real growth being decently positive, the curve has been inverted, and that doesn't match the reality that we're seeing. And so George has been making this call for however many years now, which is expecting both bonds and stocks to reflect that higher level of nominal growth by stocks going up and bond yields going up. And so that that bet has paid off, and it continues to. But that's a reflection of what we think is the market sort of coming to grips with the idea that we are in a fiscally dominant world where the Fed actually doesn't have some of these abilities that the market thinks it does.
Okay. Is it safe to say that Jeff Snider, use of the curve and understanding of the macro, and then relating it back to what the Fed's going to do, not do, and so on, was very good, if not more and more so brilliant, right up to this point at 2022? And that he just missed the, road is closed ahead sign. And he's just carried on this blue path, which is the market rate of US Treasuries. So it makes, since this point, and we can almost put a date and time on it, from this point on, it has made his product ridiculous. Is that too strong, or do you want to tone me down, or what would you say?
So I think it's a fair characterization, and I think the kind of sad thing is like you said, like I think Jeff is almost there, which is he actually does make a couple of points that I think there's truth to, which is low rates don't act as stimulus. Low rates don't stimulate the economy. They're not an ease. There's no way you can find an ease in the data. So throughout the 2010s, when rates are low and we're in this kind of like secular stagnation world, the kind of Fisherian argument is, if nominal rates are low and nominal rates can be decomposed into, real growth and inflation, then both of those have to be low as well. And that's what we saw in the 2010s, which is rates are low and then nominal growth is low. And then he also makes, the other correct point, which is the opposite, which is that when rates are high, nominal growth tends to be high. And so that's, again, just the Fisherian argument that the nominal rate can be decomposed into real and real growth and inflation. So he's saying correctly, low rates mean, not stimulus, they mean a weak economy. And then high rates mean, a strong economy. But I think he didn't make the logical conclusion of that, which I think we have done since 2022, which is that if the Fed raises rates from zero and takes us out of that secular stagnation, low rate world, then those rate hikes function as an ease. They function as a way to lift the economy out of the pit of ZIRP. And I think that's what's happened over the last 2 years, which is that the Fed has gone from this world of ZIRP to more of a normal kind of level of rates for this level of strength in the economy. And that itself has been an ease, which is why I think there's some nuggets of truth in how he's thinking about things, but he's not connecting that it's actually stimulative then for the Fed to bring rates up to normality, which is what they've done in the last 2 years.
So basically, we're not throwing bricks at Jeff. We're actually in fairly close alignment with his thesis or how he operates. Again, it's just that he missed this exit point. Like he carried on with the blue line when reality was the green line, and this reality depicts the green line. It shows an inverted curve around the GFC, and of course the other pauses we've had. It comes almost flat in 2020. Well, you probably have more to say on that later. It comes almost flat at 2020, and then it's actually very, very positive, given the $3 to $5 to $6 trillion of injection that came from the Fed over COVID.
Yeah, the next slide has the actual slope.
Okay, all right. Okay, come on, Riddick, manage me and tell me to shut up. And
oh no. I mean, I think the next slide is good too.
Okay, got it. There we go.
Oh no, we can go one slide back. Yeah, there, yeah.
Okay, got it.
So this is if we take the 10-year mortgage implied yield minus the standard 2-year yield, we see that.
So I just want to go up. So you're taking this green line, right?
Yep. The green line minus the 2-year yield.
Got it.
And so there we see that, the curve never inverted in the last 2-3 years because there was no reason for the curve to invert because the economy was never in danger of a recession because the fiscal flow is too strong. And I think the fiscal flows have produced, a solidly upward steepening curve. So this is what we would consider the real sort of risk-free curve that reflects, a forward expectation of NGDP. And that's one of the key points about our framework is that ultimately it's nominal growth that determines asset prices and it determines the yields of assets. It's not anything else. It's not, any individual piece of data. It's that overarching how much money is being circulated in the economy. That's what determines the price of assets. And that's what you have to anchor an analysis to. And I think this is one way to do it, which is the yield curve has to be positively sloped in a world with this level of nominal growth. And we think that the true yield curve, if the Fed, as the Fed eventually starts to normalize, it's doing this QT, it's getting out of the business of managing the long end of rates. As the Fed starts to normalize, that assets will continue to reflect that upward sloping curve. And we, are betting on that to happen.
Okay. Let me flip the other way. Let's say this is the risk-free curve, and it would have been the U.S. Treasury curve in like before December 2022. Let's say that the Fed doesn't want this. Let's say the Fed wants to flatten this out, in which is usually the only way that inflation can be contained, based upon dogma for decades and decades. What does that imply in terms of the size of what the Fed has to do to come through and flatten this so that the U.S. I guess we're going the other way now, so that the U.S. Treasury curve is the risk-free curve because of what the Fed does to this curve. A little convoluted maybe, but what are we saying here that if the Fed doesn't want this status, what do they got to do?
So the Fed, if the Fed doesn't want the sort of real risk-free curve to be positively sloped, I guess there's a few things it can do. One, it can try to get a large hand in the mortgage market and substantially increase its holdings of MBS and try to dislocate perhaps even the MBS kind of rate from maybe what the real rate is. I think the other way it could do it though is just take rates back to zero and try to throw the economy back into this neo-Fisherian secular stagnation world as soon as possible and hold rates at zero. Because that's what we saw throughout and you can see in this chart in the latter half of 2010 that the Fed continued to refuse to take rates off of zero, and eventually, as it was able to impose that kind of zero rate environment, even the long end began to fall in line. And we see that with every country. We see that with Japan, Europe, that if rates are held low long enough, then the long end of the yield curve also falls to zero, reflecting that low growth in inflation. So if the Fed wanted to kind of flatten the curve again, I think it can do that. But right now it's in this world where, we need to keep rates high because the economy is too strong. And in that world, the real yield curve will always be positively sloped.
Okay, cool. All right.
Great.
Should we carry into this slide?
Yeah, so I can talk about what's going on here. So the first thing we hit on just now was the yield curve and, does it reflect reality? Is there perhaps a real risk-free curve? So that's, I think, one aspect of Jeff's framework that was good to hit on. And this is the other one that we wanted to touch on in this video, which is the issue of supply. And does the supply of treasuries matter to either the treasury yield or, sorry, does the supply of coupons relative to bills matter to treasury yields, to the yield curve, to the economy? Does it matter or does it not? And so in this, I think what's interesting is I have another tweet here by this Kobayashi letter, which I think reflects kind of the conventional wisdom here, which is, oh, there's all this government debt maturing, and there's all these, you know, issuance about to happen, all these coupons about to be issued, and who's gonna buy all these bonds? That's the conventional narrative, which is, you know, supply is gonna overwhelm the market, it's gonna break things, it's gonna cause a recession. That's on the right side. And I think Jeff is actually adopting too much of that approach in how he's seeing things. So he's saying supply does matter, issuance does matter, but also there's a ton of demand for treasuries, so it'll be fine. He's saying, you know, the excess demand for treasuries reflects a desire for liquidity, safety, and that excess demand is another recessionary kind of indicator for him. So what's happening here is there's a spectrum, which is Jeff's on one side, this Kobayashi letter's on the other side, and they're both saying supply and issuance matters for the yield of treasuries. Jeff's saying it matters, but you know the people want to buy it, so it's fine. And Kobayashi is saying supply matters and nobody wants to buy it. And so we're actually, I think, not on that spectrum at all, which is the point we're making is no, supply doesn't matter at all. What matters is how much new fiscal money is entering the economy and what that means for nominal growth. That's all that matters. So I think these two tweets kind of give that framing. So I think on the left side on Jeff's tweet, he said, you know, despite the overwhelming debt, you know, Treasury market prices remain surprisingly stable. Even with quantitative tightening, the market hardly flinched. So the question is, you know, how is this possible? How can the government keep selling trillions in deficits and the market barely reacts? So he's saying, you know, yes, the market needs to absorb this debt somehow. And because the economy is so weak, everybody's happy to buy up this debt. And we're saying, no, it's not a question. It's actually not a question of does somebody want to buy the debt or not? Meaning, you know, Jeff is still asking the question, who will buy all the debt? And he's just saying there actually are people to buy the debt. And then Kobayashi is saying who will buy the debt and there's nobody to buy the debt. And we're saying the question of who will buy the debt is the wrong question to be asking because the government is self-financing. The government's spending finances that issuance because it first floods the economy with that new money, and then that new money can finance the purchase of treasuries. So we're saying that question of who will buy the debt is the wrong question to be asking.
Cool. And let's flip it on its ear a bit. Describe what the world's like, or certainly what the U.S. economy is like, if Jeff is right. Like, what is happening? What do you want to see?
If Jeff's right that there is actually, you know, this overwhelming demand for treasuries and they're keeping rates low, then we would see nominal growth falling. We'd see real growth negative. We would see a typical recessionary self-reinforcing environment, right?
Okay, and actually, it's safe to say it would be a rather dramatic recession.
From these levels, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And how about the other side of the spectrum here that you talked about?
So yeah, so if Kobayashi is right that, you know, nobody's gonna, I mean, honestly, I don't even know how to like describe what the worldview that he's putting out, because he's basically saying like there's not going to be a buyer of debt. That's under some assumption that like the government doesn't have seigniorage, it can't, you know, print its own currency. That
we become Argentina overnight.
Yeah, we become an emerging market that's like has all of our debt denominated in gold or something, and now like we're just gonna experience hyperinflation. I guess yeah, his worldview is the U.S. is gonna enter hyperinflation, and I think that's kind of asinine.
So the point I'm making, and correct me, like, or discuss it with me, is that while these people, or Jeff Snider and then Kobayashi letter, seem reasonable or logical, they're actually stating very, very dramatic, I would say even fictional, made-for-TV movies of what they think the economy is going to be to do shortly.
Yes,
it's impossible to see. Yeah,
it's very apocalyptic. I think both of these scenarios, and we're saying no. There's no need for that thought right now at all.
Okay. All right.
And so just to hit on that point, and so we have a video that we recorded last week called "Why the QRA Doesn't Matter" that hits on this point, where, you know, every quarter the Treasury says we're going to do this many coupons and this many bills, and then everybody, at least for the last 2 quarters, actually for most quarters nobody seems to care about the QRA, but it seems like the last 2 or 3 quarters it's become this huge market.
The last quarter.
Last quarter. I think even the summer 2023 one, And so, you know, I feel like, especially in some of the social media stuff that I'm looking at, the sentiment is that the supply and the choice of whether to issue bills or bonds or notes is a huge market moving event. And our point is, and I think this chart does does a good job of that, which is there's no actual relationship between the issuance of notes and bonds versus the 10-year yield. Because what we're saying is whether a new dollar of fiscal spending is issued as a bill or as a note or as a bond, that doesn't matter. The way that the bond is funded doesn't matter, because that's the secondary thing. The funding of the spending is a secondary thing. The first thing, the thing that actually matters, is the fact that money was spent. The fact that the government decided we're going to spend this money on this stimulus check or this, you know, government program. That's the thing that matters, because that flows through to NGDP, and NGDP is what determines asset prices and asset yields. So here we can see, like, there's just no, I'm just putting these lines on top of each other because there's just no relationship between the change in the amount of notes and bonds outstanding versus the 10-year yield. But if we go to the next slide, this is, I think, what we ultimately get to. This is basically our like holy chart, which is NGDP growth, the growth in the economy. That's what ultimately anchors bond yields, because, you know, bond yields reflect, again, it's the Fisher equation. Bond yields ultimately have to reflect that forward expectation of NGDP. And that's what we see here, which is that this is what that true anchoring looks like, not, you know, whether the debt was issued at this maturity or that maturity. What matters is the federal government right now is spending, has a deficit of, you know, 6%, 7% of GDP. That adds to nominal GDP. That means that the risk-free rates are going to have to be higher, and then ultimately Treasury yields are going to have to rise to reflect that higher level of nominal growth. This is the way that
Very cool. And just to make sure we're not doing apples and oranges, although I don't think it at all weakens your point. If this were the risk-free curve,
it would be
10-year rate, that would show even more closing in on NGDP.
Absolutely.
But, you know, like it put it right about here right now where my cursor is.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. Anything else, Riddick?
So that's what we have for this video. Just wanted to hit a little bit deeper those 2 points. So I put out a piece about you know, Jeff Snider's framework and where we think there are some issues. Put it out on Monday, I believe. Please check it out. I thought it was some pretty interesting thoughts. Again, at a high level, the issue is we all see the same economic data, which is NGDP growth is at 6%. There's, you know, 150,000 initial claims are at secular low. Unemployment's at secular low. Jeff obviously sees the same economic data we do, but and then we also see the same market data, and we all agree the market data disagrees with the economic data. One of them has to be right. To us, the economic data and GDP, that's the reality. You can't argue with that. And therefore, you know, markets make mistakes all the time. They make huge mistakes all the time. We think that the market's been making a mistake since 2022. Jeff tends to think that the market has this like crystal ball of wisdom that's able to like parse through the economic data and actually, yeah, NGDP is high right now, but the market's saying, no, it won't be high in the future. We're saying the market is incorrect to think that NGDP growth won't be high in the future. So we express a bet by being long stock, short bonds. And I think that's the view that'll continue for the foreseeable future. So yeah, that's what I had for this video, and I'd love if y'all could check out the piece as well.
Right. Please subscribe to the Monetary Frontier to get this in the Substack version. Riddick, what are you going to do? Are you going to tag this on to the existing Substack on Jeff Snider?
I'll make a new post. I'll make a new post. I'll make a new post.
Good stuff. And if you find this of value, you should definitely follow Riddick. Riddick, what's your X?
It's at RP Goyal, GOYAL _.
Okay, and then subscribe to the Monetary Frontier. All right, Riddick, thank you. I think this is a great job, obviously, because you know, we're in total agreement. But I think our agreement is based upon being students of the last, I don't know, century of economic dogma, and I would like to think that we saw the exit sign, roads closed ahead, and made the right exit.
I think so too.
So thank you very much. Great work.
Thanks. All right.
Okay.